Hi, welcome to Integrative Lawyers of the World, where we believe that lawyers can and do contribute to the healing of the world. We believe this because we know lawyers who are doing just this. Hi, I'm your host, Carrie Raleigh, and our guest this episode is Ron Ousky. Ron helps people create bright futures in their difficult times. In 2006, he co-authored a book with Stu Webb, The Collaborative Way to Divorce, the revolutionary method that results in less stress, lower cost, happier kids without going to court. In 2015, he received the American Bar Association's Lawyer Problem Solver Award. He conducts trainings in North America, South America, and in Europe. He's co-founder of the Collaborative Alliance Executive Suites, which is an interdisciplinary family law center. And he is with us today to share his wisdom and path on the collaborative path. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. To support Integrative Lawyers of the World and to listen to more episodes, go to our website at www.integrativelaw.com. Ron, thank you so much for joining us today. It looks like, I see outside your window, it looks like it's a nice sunny day by you.
It is. It's pretty sunny for a Minnesota day, so we're quite happy with it. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
I'm in Cleveland, Ohio area right now. We're having a rainy, dreary day. But yeah, it's nice. The earth needs the rain, so it's good. And it's getting a slow drizzle. I read on your law firm's website that you grew up in a small Norman Rockwell-like town of 200 less people. But what's even more amazing to me is when you said after all your years of practicing law, you still have the romanticized belief in life's possibilities.
That's absolutely true. And I see things remind me of that almost every week, every day. You know, it's been great to see what has unfolded just in the time I've practiced and the things that are unfolding every day. As much as I've been grateful to be part of what I think is a mini revolution in the last 30 years, I really believe we're just beginning to see what we can really be as part of this. So it's been exciting.
Yeah, that's interesting. And when you're talking about the mini revolution of the last 30 years, you're talking about the transformation of the practice of law and collaborative law practice?
Yes, and I, my work has been predominantly in collaborative law. I see myself in the integrative law world as a broader part of that umbrella, but collaborative is where I got my roots. I started working with families and really understanding the struggles that families had in a divorce. And Stu Webb came up with this idea of collaborative law, which was a way to help families through conflict differently. And it was a transformative thing for me to see what possibilities there were if we just shifted the way we thought about family law. So that was the beginning for me.
What was the big shift?
It's interesting because when Stu came along, he had what was a subtle thing that I didn't fully understand at first. He like so many of us, he knew it had to be done differently. Like many of us who had been to court with families, we realized we were damaging relationships, even though we weren't trying to do that. And not just going to trial, but operating in the shadow of the courthouse. If you operate in a threat-based environment, trying to get people to settle because if they don't settle, a judge will make them settle, doesn't create great agreements for families. It does a lot of damage. And so many of us, so many people have been struggling for years trying to figure out, well, we know it's best not to do it that way. What's the better way? And of course, mediation existed, which was wonderful. But we needed some way for the lawyers, for the advocates to rethink their part of this as well. And when Stu came along with this idea that was, again, so subtle it's easy to miss it, but he said if you created a process in which the lawyers at the very beginning would commit in writing to withdraw if the matter went to court, then you would create a culture in which lawyers would start to rethink their role. That was sort of the promise of it. And I think the part that was subtle is the idea that the lawyers had to be able to withdraw so that they could think outside of it. It was a true paradigm shift, because while most of us thought we were already thinking holistically in wonderful ways, it wasn't until we stepped outside that shadow of the courthouse that we started to really think about what this could be. So that was the initial piece for me. But even then, it took me a while to get a feel for it. And it wasn't until Stu's idea of collaborative law formed up with what they were doing in California, people like Nancy Ross and others doing the collaborative team movement. They were doing a team movement. What their idea was that rather than having just lawyers at the table, we ought to have mental health professionals and financial people, child specialists, people that deal with the whole family, because divorce, as painful as it is really only partly a legal problem. I would guess maybe 30% legal. I mean, most of it is communication, parenting, finance, healing, a lot of things that lawyers care about, but aren't necessarily the ones who are specialized in addressing. So when I started to see how we could team with mental health professionals and financial people, a light bulb went off in my head. I thought, wow, the opportunity to get deeper resolution, not just get people a settlement, but get them something that's going to work. Because I think that's one of the myths in family law is that we just need to get them a settlement. If we get them a piece of paper, then we've done our job. Well, getting a settlement is only the beginning. That's when their lives are starting. We need to give them resources and ways to start their new lives in a better way. And by integrating all these professions, it became much more exciting for me. I realized we weren't just talking about settlement. We're talking about, as Pauline Tesler talks about, deeper resolution of issues, which I think is key to all of this.
And it really is how, in my introduction, I said this, but I got it from your law firm website about how you are helping people create brighter futures. And you're doing it at a time where they probably can't see the bright future themselves. And so by providing all those different disciplines and different support people around them, it really is a noble purpose serving families. And that's like, the parents and the kids. And families are part of communities. So it really is a noble purpose.
Well, thank you. And that is the one of the main core pieces, the idea of getting to look at a brighter future, because divorce is horribly unfair, as anybody who's been through it will attest, that it requires you to make some of the most important decisions in your life at a time where you might feel least capable of doing so. You're scared, you're angry, you're sad, and yet here are all these people trying to have you make life decisions. And that's a really unfair environment, and we need to help people address that with all the support they can, not just legal, but mental health and financial, so that they can restart their lives, so that 5 and 10 and 15 years later, they can look back and say, as hard as that was, it was a time in which things got better. And, so often people have been through divorce will ask me, how can you stand to do this horrible work? Don't you hate seeing people at this difficult time in their lives? And I liken it to being in the emergency room of a hospital. If you thought about how people got there, you would feel pretty awful. But if you think, well, this is when the healing starts, and if you've done it long enough to know that this is when people start to get better and families start to get better, it can be quite rewarding. And so that idea of helping them think about the future, and I can almost see my clients' face light up sometimes when we can start to paint a picture of what their life might look like when they're through this nightmare, when they're on the other end of things for themselves and their children, and just helping them have a vision of what that future might look like is a key part of this.
I was going to ask, give a very succinct description of collaborative law, which you've already done in our conversation, but the title of your book was Stu Webb. I mean, that pretty much captures it.
Yeah, that captures certainly what it tries to do is reduce the stress and be better for children and better for families and better for people. And so I think people get at the core, if we're trying to help them make their world better. The core tangible piece, and I'll try to explain it with less legalese, is that it starts with the idea that the lawyers are working outside of the courtroom, and so you get a blend between neutral people, good family specialists, and financial people who are neutral, kind of like mediators. And yet you get advocates, somebody who's an ally, your friend, who's going to be a friend in a different way. And I think that's the kind of paradigm shift piece, because people tend to think of lawyers as either irrelevant or gladiators. And they don't realize that they could be the old idea of legal counsel, someone who's there to help you find your better self and even help your spouse recognize that better self. And I tell people, when you hear about a lawyer as an advocate, you automatically think the lawyer is going to go into the room and argue or insult and do these things. And really, that's the very last thing that families need, particularly because it doesn't work. But it just creates more disharmony. But they need somebody who feels like they're on their side, or they know is on their side. And I often tell when I'm talking to a couple together, I say, well, look, if I was your friend, say I'm talking to the wife, and my job is to be your best friend, I don't really want to become your spouse's enemy. In fact, I can be a better friend if I'm not their enemy. because I need to get them to say yes to things that matter to them as that matter to you. In order to get them to say yes, I have to think about what they care about. And I think clients immediately grasp how that's better if the other counsel is doing it the same way. And so some of the idea is getting synergistic lawyering, because if I'm trying to, appeal to their common interests and the things they care about together, and the other lawyer is doing a whole different kind of dance, it creates this disharmony. And part of the idea of collaborative law is to line up like-minded lawyers. It's kind of the opposite of the old fight fire with fire. It's sort of saying, well, I'll find somebody who will speak in a holistic, interest-based manner if you will as well. And that way they can get a different kind of advocacy where they really truly are getting win-win scenarios, because most people in divorce have more in common than they differ about. If we can build on the things they have in common, then the differences become easier to mend. So that's the core behind it. And then you start with the lawyer part, but then collaborative law means that once you understand the lawyer part, that opens the door to the other part, the financial part, the mental health part. If we lock the courthouse door, sort of, or at least temporarily lock it, we get people out of a rights-based mentality and onto an interest-based or goal-based mentality. And that allows them to see that it isn't the lawyers who are going to have to be the chief priests of this. It's the mental health people, the financial people, the child specialists. Those people are going to help their family grow so that they can not only get their divorce agreement, but they can develop some skills. And that's always the thing I love seeing the most, is that when they come through the process, not only less damaged than the old process, but actually enhanced in their ability to co-parent, enhanced in their ability to talk to their spouse, improved in their ability to handle their finances even. People should be given the opportunity to improve their life skills as they enter the next chapter. And we provide that opportunity, which to me is the most rewarding part of the work.
You said a few things that really caught my interest, and one was most people in divorce have more things in common than they have that divides them or separates them. Can you pick up on that a little bit? Because I think a lot of
Sure.
people going through it, they probably lose sight of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They do. And of course, it's easiest to see with people that have young children, even grown children, because most people who've been through divorce, if they have children, if you ask them 10 years later what really mattered, it's going to be how their children got through this. Did they grow to be happy, healthy children with a good relationship with both parents? That's by far the most important thing. And if you agree on that, I mean, that's a common interest that almost both spouses almost always have. And that's that's the most important piece. When you if you can focus on that, figuring out who gets the sofa, who gets this or that, or you'll become far less important. And so that's the easiest piece. But there are other pieces, even for people. I'm amazed that even people that don't have children and have a common relationship, want to honor what they've had together. That they have a relationship that sure it has fallen apart, but they don't want to dishonor that. I've seen people without children who really care about being friends in a post-divorce world, or even doing this with integrity. And so that's a common interest. Even the idea of keeping costs down and not giving everything you've saved to lawyers is a common interest. And so, and getting your own well-being, your own mental health, and having some healing is a common interest. So nobody has to lose for those things to happen. Now, sure, there are differences. There's only so many dollars to go around, and there's only so many hours in the lives of the children. But those differences become easier to work through once you've built on a common interest. And one of the first things we do in a collaborative case is we sit down with both spouses and we ask them what their big picture goals are. What do they care about at the highest level? And they will almost always describe things that are common, that are in common. If I could sit with one spouse in a room privately and write the highest level goals, and sit with the other spouse privately and do the same, they would overlap on 80 or 90% of the big picture goals. And that's the part that's missing. We don't realize these people have things that are in common. And ironically, when I was doing litigation or even traditional negotiation, we not only didn't preserve those things, we damaged them. If their relationship with their spouse was the most important thing, we were damaging that. It's the biggest asset they have, and we didn't realize we were crushing that while we were getting them $2,000 more in the financial settlement and damaging by far the most important asset by trampling over the relationship, sometimes unwittingly. So.
When there's one spouse that wants the divorce and the other one does not, or who feels let down, knowing that the other spouse wants to honor their relationship, I could see that as something something that each spouse probably needs, like something that they need to feel maybe, or need to understand, or it's very helpful to understand that the other spouse may be feeling that way too.
Yeah, that's why one of the things that's become popular is the idea of closure counseling, or sometimes discernment counseling or coaching to help people kind of grieve the relationship. I mean, to some extent, divorce law is sort of is marriage hospice care. We are having something that has to be grieved. You can't just slam the door and pretend it never happened, even if there aren't children. This was a part of you that was in the relationship with somebody, and as much as you might be the spouse that really is ready to move on, or you might be the spouse that wishes it wasn't happening. And it is common. I mean, that's one of the hardest things is you get a spouse that's leaning out and a spouse who's not. And always very painful to be working with somebody who wishes this wasn't happening. And yet, you want to find some way for them to honor what has happened. So it's easy when they have young children. At least you can say, look, you're going to be in a relationship the rest of your life. The relationship's not going to end. It's not going to be in the same home. It's not a married relationship. It's a relationship. But even people who don't have children in common, I think, have some sense that they don't want to write off the last 10 years of their life and pretend that it never happened. It did happen, and they need to be able to honor that in some way.
Now, you were a trial lawyer, a good trial lawyer before starting the collaborative practice. Are there some things, this is like a two-part question that will hopefully fold together and you can answer it however you want. On one hand, is there some trial skills or skills of a trial lawyer that is helpful or useful in the collaborative practice? And then on the reverse side, are there some skills of a trial lawyer that you may want to put on rest a little bit when you're in the collaborative practice?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm going to start with the second piece first because it's the easiest part. Because I think a lot of people think that once you've been a trial lawyer, you can never undo those things, and it's hard to get past those bad habits. The idea of using argument and insult as a way to get things. And I was good at argument, and it was one of the things I was best at in law school. And now I spend most of my career telling people how useless argument can be in this context. But the idea of wanting to argue, wanting to control things, lawyers tend to be control people, even if we think it's for the greater good. We've got an idea what this family needs, and we want to impose that on them. And so those skills are hard to let go of. And that's the stuff that trials can kind of create, that sense of trying to control or trying to argue. On the other hand, I mean, it's interesting because I don't know if anybody's ever asked me whether there's any part of trial work that is valuable, because we tend to dismiss that. But I think in reality, at least it depends on the kind of trial lawyer. The best trial lawyers are the ones that are at least partly psychologists as well. As you think about what's going on in the other person's mind, and you think about what's going on in the judge's mind, so you can get some degree of empathy. Even when I was a trial lawyer in a custody matter, the first thing I would do is describe good things about the other parent, and to say because they're so eager to say all these other things, but yet I first of all help the judge see my client as more human. Because if you walk up there and say, "Well, this person is 100% awful," I mean, first of all, they're not going to believe you. And secondly, they're going to wonder about you. Why did you marry and have children with somebody who's 100% awful? Now, it's not that that never happens, but usually that's just the emotions talking. And so I think as a trial lawyer, good trial lawyers, certainly trial lawyers who do work with juries have to think about human psychology. And even divorce trial lawyers have to think about, the psychology of things, and even having some degree of empathy. You would sit down with my client and say, well, I wonder if your spouse is seeing it a different way. And they might say, well, whose side are you on? Why are you helping me understand how my spouse is seeing it? Say, well, in order to move forward, understanding how somebody sees the world is useful, even if you're in trial, but it's particularly useful when you're trying to reach an agreement.
So much of our advocacy in law school is taught through argument. How do you manage that to be an advocate without being voice for persuasion or a voice of argument within the collaborative practice?
That's really a tremendous challenge. Is that it's a challenge for us internally to understand that there are better tools than argument, but also to be able to reassure our clients. And I used to have up on my wall, the phrase from John F. Kennedy's inaugural speech that said, "We must always remember that civility is not weakness." And that's a hard thing for people, because they think if you're going to be civil with this spouse who they've come to really be angry with, that's a sign of weakness, that you're not going to be strong enough for them. And that can create a real fear. And part of the challenge is helping them understand that my desire to be civil with their spouse isn't an abandonment of them. It's a way to be stronger and help them understand that. And one of the early experiences I had with that, during even on a collaborative case, during a meeting And I think one of my clients, during a break, in one of our meetings of discussions and negotiation, the client, I could tell, wanted me to be a little stronger in there. And they said, well, I want you to go in and argue this point or that point. And rather than try to talk them out of it, I would say, well, argument doesn't work. I said, well, let's write out how that would go. What exactly would you like me to say? And they kind of wrote down, they told me, well, I want you to say how he did this thing or that thing. And I said, okay, now let's talk about what he's going to say in response. Well, he's going to say this and that. Then what are we? I mean, as they played it out in their own minds, they realized that argument, even though that it felt kind of soothing to have their lawyer make this argument, they realized it was just going to lead them to a brick wall. It was going to lead to get an argument coming back that wasn't going to feel so good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that whole kind of self-discovery of helping them realize we're being civil and respectful, not out of weakness, but out of strength. And that's a hard thing in any of our culture to realize that, I mean, you look at Gandhi, you look at Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
These are people that taught us that you can be much stronger through civility than you can through aggression. And yet it's counter to our thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. Even today, it still is.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
But there is something in the process for someone to know I had my advocate next to me, someone who's got my back. And so when you're talking about whatever issue that may came up, maybe there's a dispute over allocation of child support or something like that. Just because if I'm hearing you correctly, just because you're civil and respectful doesn't mean that you give in on your client's interest or wishes. It's how you approach it with the other side.
That's absolutely true. And it's a really important thing. And I know some of my collaborative colleagues don't like the word advocacy because they associate it with zealous advocacy and old style advocacy. I'm okay with the term when it's been redefined, because advocacy doesn't mean argument. There's a great book written by Deborah Tianin called The Argument Culture, in which, she breaks down the idea that we think of argument and advocacy as the same thing, and they're not. And I think the clients need to know that they've got an advocate. That's why it's different than just mediation or other things. I think people understand the role of neutral. They don't understand how an advocate can be done differently. Advocacy can be done. And I try to shift the term from advocacy to friend, and so that they realize, okay, you've got a friend at the table, and the friend is there. Like any friend, I'm there to help you, and for them to know in this scary time, I'm there to be their friend. Now, I also, the other kind of friend piece of them. Well, the difference between a best friend and an okay friend is that an okay friend tells you what you want to hear, and a best friend tells you what you need to hear. And sometimes that's hard, because sometimes they're having to say, well, they have a point there, that maybe we have to compromise on this piece. And sometimes that can feel like abandonment. It's like, well, wait a minute, whose side are you on? Why are you saying we have to compromise? And that's very, very difficult. And part of the skill of collaborative practice from the lawyer's standpoint is to give enough empathy so they know that you're there with them, and then help challenge them to realize that to get forward, they have to be able to see it from the other side's point of view as well. And that's not weakness, but it can feel like that when people are in pain.
We are taking a brief break from this conversation to ask for your financial support. With each episode, we hope you can see how lawyers and peacemakers like you are contributing to the healing of the world. It takes many kinds of resources for the integrative law movement to keep going and affecting change. Your monetary donation can help us continue this important work by supporting the activities and the members of this community. Each contribution goes to promote the stability and accessibility of the movement and to support basic expenses like our Mighty Network group, web hosting, social media and event management, and this Integrative Lawyers of the World podcast. Because we like to give people choices, we have ongoing monthly options to match your budget, or you can make a one-time donation. Thanks to our non-profit corporate sponsor, the Renaissance Law Society, US supporters are able to make tax-deductible donations. Supporters from other countries, please check your local tax laws. For ways to support the integrative law movement and our world-changing work, go to our website at www.integrativelaw.com and click on Support the Movement tab at the top of the page. Another great way to support us is to rate us 5 stars and comment, like, follow or subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Google, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. These ratings and interactions help us get seen and heard by even more people to make an even stronger impact. Thank you for your support and spending time with us today. Enjoy the rest of this conversation.
Now, one of the key things in collaborative law is that the lawyers agree not to take the matter to court should it not settle. When I talk to some friends who are not collaborative lawyers about that, they don't quite understand why you need that. They say if a lawyer is acting with integrity, they're always going to have that interest to the client. You don't need to have that provision in there. What kind of response do you get, and why do you think it's so important to have that in there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. And that is a central question on collaborative practice, because I have many, many good friends who are wonderful, what I call small C collaborative lawyers. They really care about settlement, care about clients, and don't quite get this withdrawal agreement. And I confess early on when Stu came up with this idea, I thought, yeah, it's great. You're saying be friendly, be this, be that. But this withdrawal agreement, yeah, I don't know if that's so important. It's something that you almost have to experience to see how much that shifts the dynamic. I mean, the one thing I point to is that I'm guessing there have been 100 movements started around the world in terms of family law lawyers trying to behave better. There's only one you're going to find in a textbook, and that's Stu's, because he's the only one that said you have to create a different, because we all think we're being a certain way, and it's only when you take that shift out of the courtroom environment that you see the difference that can happen. Now, if it's interesting, because if you talk to collaborative lawyers, people like myself who do all collaborative, of course, we're going to say that environment with the withdrawal agreement is really powerful and better than what we saw. If you talk to lawyers who, like you've described, wonderful people who have operated outside the participant agreement, they're going to see they have a better atmosphere there. But the one proof I would offer, if you talk to anybody that's done at least 100 cases in both environments, they will tell you that the environment, when you step outside the shadow of the courthouse, is increasingly better. Now, does that mean it always is? It's you can create that environment sometimes without it if you have the right frame of mind. And the way Stu Webb described it when he first started the process, he wrote a letter to his friend who was a justice in the Supreme Court, and he said, we've all had cases that happen wonderfully, where the other attorney behaves the way we want to, we behave the way we want to, our clients step up, and it's a wonderful experience. Once in a while that happened without the withdrawal agreement. And he said, what if we take what happens once in a while accidentally and make it happen deliberately? So, it's not that it never happens out there, but if you create an environment, if you step outside that shadow, the opportunity to go much deeper is there. And I can honestly say, and I was even though I was a good trial lawyer, I always saw myself as a settlement lawyer, and I had wonderful settlements, but I see things every month in a collaborative case that I never saw in 20 years of litigation. I see things that sometimes literally move me to tears. I see clients jump up and give each other a hug in the middle of the negotiation, stuff I never saw. And without the withdrawal agreement, none of that would have ever happened.
Wow.
And does it happen that way in every case? Of course not. Some cases don't work, but it gives people an opportunity to go deeper in a way that we never would have understood without the withdrawal agreement.
I like how you described it as outside the shadow of the courthouse, because if you're still in it, you're still going to see the courthouse, and that's still subconsciously or whatever, you're still part of the court system. So if we're going to do something outside of the court system, well, let's be outside of the court system. And I think it was earlier in our conversation where you said that forces us to focus on other skills as well and learn how to be more adept in this out of court scenario.
Yeah, no, that's so critical. And that's the idea of a rights-based or law-based system versus an interest-based or common interest system. And I think we don't realize it, but even negotiating in the shadow of the courthouse, even if you never really go to court, becomes kind of a threat-based system. The idea of, okay, you should settle with your spouse because otherwise the judge is going to force you to do that. That's a threat-based way of looking at things. If you make decisions out of threat versus common interest, there is a material difference in that. And I don't think, until I operated in the collaborative system, I didn't realize how threat-based some of my settlements were. And we try to be softer than that, but there is a major, major difference. And clients come in, they don't necessarily think it's threat-based, they think rights-based. So I have a right to this, I have a right to that. And of course, it's human nature for us to think that we're right about things and our spouse is wrong. And so even though we don't want to go to court, we sort of imagine if we're in front of a judge, he or she would see things our way because, I'm right about things. And of course, your spouse is thinking the same things. And so the idea that somebody out there in that rights-based system is going to fix things is a hard illusion to eliminate. And apart from who's right and who's wrong, the idea that somebody else can correct my problem for me, which is interesting when you think about something like raising small children. The idea that a judge, a government official, is going to navigate you through that in a way that's going to work for your life. So, for example, people say, well, gee, he let or she let them watch that TV program. They never should have done that. Okay, so you're saying you want a government official to regulate the TV programs? Are they going to show up in your living room and tell you what? I mean, it's weird. I consider myself a strong liberal, and I think the government should do a lot of things. But the last thing I think it ought to be doing is showing up in your living room, telling you what TV you should watch. And yet that they don't realize going to court, even if a judge issues a decree, they're like, how are you going to monitor that? You've got 1,000 decisions to make for your children. How is that going to work over time? And if you have the illusion that somebody out there in a robe is going to fix that, you're never really going to find a solution. But if you step outside that shadow, you'll start looking for solutions inside yourself. So that's the true paradigm shift in this. I really think there will come a time, maybe 100 years from now, where we'll wonder why we ever thought a judge would ever be an appropriate place to go for parenting problems. We'll go to a parenting specialist. We'll never think we should have given somebody with a law degree authority over our children. It makes no sense. They taught me nothing in law school about anybody's children. Yeah, and it made no sense that we would put judges in that situation.
So that leads us into where I'd like to go next in our conversation, how you said you think a lot has happened in terms of a revolution in the legal system, but you think there's even more to come. Would you like to say anything about your collaborative alliance executive suites? Because that seems like it's a nice model that other professionals might like to follow or at least be aware of.
Yes, I would, because it is, as I mentioned, part of the idea of collaborative is that it's interdisciplinary. So we have professionals all over town, and usually you would hire, anywhere from 4 or 5 professionals to help you. And you might have a child specialist in one part of town and the attorney in the other part of town and maybe a financial neutral in the other part. And you thought, well, okay, that's okay, but isn't that kind of expensive and difficult? And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we get a lot of those professionals in the same space? And so about 18 years ago, financial neutral, who I worked with a lot, Amy Wolf and myself, decided, well, let's create this collaborative alliance space, bringing people under the same roof. And we started, and it worked even far better than we thought. It's grown, several times over the years, and we now have cases which even I'll talk about. COVID has shifted this, but even in cases where we're meeting together, almost always we could just walk down the hall and see people, and a client would come to one space and one very soothing, family-centered space with very comfortable offices that look more like therapist offices, and know that the professionals will come to them. They don't have to chase all over town. Now, so that was the thing behind it, which we thought was better for clients than it was, and better for professionals, because if I want to talk to the child specialist or financial, I can go down the hall and say, here's something that's going on, or even the other attorney. Now, with COVID, so much is being done by Zoom that I've done collaborative cases now with people in Brazil and all over the world. I mean, you can do a collaborative case anywhere, and it works. I still tend to favor face-to-face on some meetings, and I like the idea of being together, but that's the idea of being physically together does help from times. And so the idea was having people in the same physical space, and even be able to design a space that's more family oriented rather than having sort of power symbols that lawyers normally use. We use more family symbols, more like a therapist's office. So that's helped a lot.
Sounds beautiful. Did you say do you handle like collaborative cases via Zoom, like international ones?
Yeah, I've not a lot of them, but a few. I've done one with a colleague of mine in Brazil. I've done a couple in Arizona and one with a Florida colleague. And so if it comes up, obviously you have to deal with there's different jurisdictions. So I need a local counsel in a state, if it's a state or country which I don't practice. I need somebody locally to vouch for the legal part. But we can do the collaborative part by Zoom anywhere in the world.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's wonderful. I didn't realize that. That's nice.
Yeah.
Now for the expansion part of the conversation, Kim Wright, is the founder of Integrative Lawyers of the World and one of the founders of the Integrative Law Movement. And all of Series 5 is focused on collaborative law because we believe collaborative law is is a form of integrative law. They share similar values and pieces. And I'd like to ask you, what are your thoughts about the intersection or the relationship between collaborative law and integrative law? Last year, Kim had a booth at the IACP conference.
In Orlando, yes.
And some of the collaborative lawyers came up to her. They didn't know what integrative law was, and they didn't think collaborative law fit with integrative law. And so I'd like to ask you, what do you think about that?
Well, yes, thank you for that. And actually, doing this podcast and reading back up on this has helped me redouble my efforts to increase that level of communication, because I've been aware of integrative law for a long time and haven't involved myself at the level that I want to involve myself in, because they've been great sister movements going on for many years. And I knew Kim, I met her first at a collaborative conference many, many years ago. And Pauline Tesler was a big part of this. I've known from Pauline, we were at a conference together, our mini conference together. And I've known that integrative law expands and creates a larger umbrella, for all the kind of the sentiments and the kind of the spirit of what collaborative law is about. I mean, we are a specific method and an idea under that umbrella, but I don't think many collaborative professionals are aware of that and aware of that bond and connection. And I want to, from this, and I help even in my own community, change that kind of thinking, because while collaborative law is a specific process and specific idea predominantly used in family law, it bears fruit from that broader idea about what lawyers can be and what's inside of them. And looking at their website again, it reminded me of all the great things that Kim and others have fostered. There's no better way to describe what we are looking for within our professionals. It comes from what's inside of you. Yes, there's a technique, but the people that do that technique best are really aligned with that, and people that look at the values that you are inspiring and integrate. And it's so wonderful to see, that integrative law has, in Kim's work, has been so much around the globe, and I'm so proud of how collaborative is spread around the globe. But this has gone even deeper, and it shows how the problems that we're wrestling with in our culture are so similar to what they are in every other part of the world, and it really does create that sense of connectedness, which I think is so important. That they can really provide fuel for that. So I really. I'm not surprised. I saw Kim at the conference, and I said, I loved Kim. I've known for ages, so I embraced her with great warmth. But I'm sure a lot of people are like, what is this? And even though, again, Pauline Tesler, one of our key leading collaborative people in the beginning, has been a big part of that. But I think a lot of people in the collaborative movement aren't as aware of the integrative law movement as I'd like them to be. So,
well, thank you for being a part of it and being part of our show. And I think one of the areas where we see some of this interconnectedness or the overlapping of values and how it transcends family law and into the legal system, into whatever sector of the legal system you provide, is something that you said, I don't know, earlier in the conversation about going from rights-based way of thinking to common interest way of thinking. And I know that is, a tenet of collaborative law, but when you look at how the world dealt with COVID and some of the responses that came out, you saw some of the tensions where people were, seem like a lot of tensions came out when people are thinking of rights-based. What are my rights? What are my rights? And while other people are thinking, hey, we have some common interest here. So there's the shift from one to the other can help more than collaborative law, more than the legal system.
Oh, that's so true. And it's so interesting because I see what I see playing out in this political arena seems so similar to what I see in my office every day. And not just in terms of rights-based versus interest rates, but seeing how positional bargaining can drive you deeper in your position. Even people who have common values have become political enemies because they have to line up with a position. And there's more of a strong emphasis towards that than ever now. And then during the COVID, you saw that. I mean, you're either for or you're against vaccine. I'm for mask, or I'm against vaccine. You had to line up with a tribe from day one. And it really stopped the thinking, even among people that you cared about and loved a lot. There were these horrible differences. And we see that throughout so much of our culture. And I think, what I understand so much around the world, there's whether it's out of fear or whatever it is, a bit more sense of nationalism, a sense of them or us. It's so strange because on the one hand, I do think there's a growing inner movement of connectedness, of which integrative law is part of it, and yet there's this larger layer on top of divisiveness. Now, maybe in my most optimistic self, I want to think that that's the last hurrah, that they sense connectedness is is bubbling, and they're scared, and so they're lashing out, and that but what's going to arise ultimately is a sense of connectedness. But right now, if you look at certainly our country and around the world, on the surface, there's not a lot of great feeling of connectedness right now.
It's interesting that you said that because I see the same thing. Like when you're in our community, what's your collaborative law community, the integrative law community, or I do some meditation, so I'm in like a meditation community. When I'm in those communities, you see everyone sharing in those community the values of our interconnectedness, what of our common interests, how can we raise up the whole earth and the planet. So, and you see lots of people doing just that, but then when you turn on the media or you walk out in the news, you just see the headlines of the divisiveness and the positional thinking, and you're thinking, is my world made up, or is this world, like, they're both existing at the same time?
Yeah, and it is so true, and it has been so painful for so many of us. It has divided families and states and cultures in a way that is disheartening. And yet, being part of movements like this and really believe that the inner self is going to, think different. Because I happen to grow up in a rural area where many of the people there think much differently politically than I do. And if we went down there and got into a political discussion, we would feel very divided. And yet I know many of those people would do anything for me. I think underneath it, they are people who value what I value, who care about me. And yet we are given this whole feeling of being divided, more divided than ever. And so I hope movements like this, even though we're focusing on doing that within the law, can lead to that kind of deeper sense of this. I just saw a thing, in the paper the other day about, the idea that, the golden rule is sort of the center point of most religions, and even among secular people, the idea of doing unto others. And then they had different variations of the golden rule. But the coolest one, I forget who it was by, would say, it talked a lot about how we treat others. And then the one was like, there is no other, and I think that's the ultimate idea. It's not how you treat others, it's knowing that there is no other that takes it away. And I think there's more, of a sentiment for that conversation than I've ever heard. And I hope that can continue to rise.
I know when I have conversations with Kim about this topic sometimes too, how do we maneuver between in the positional world, and people are taking the tribes, and you're having these difficult conversations, and her response is always get people talking about their values. And when we talk about their values, then we can start talking about common interest. And then when we do that, some of the positional guards will lay down, I guess, or lie down. And so I'll just ask for your thoughts on that. Like when we're dealing with the positional posturing, whether it's in the, legal arena or business arena or in your family dining room, what advice do you have?
Well, yeah, it's I really do think, as simple as it can be, is this. I think we all individually have to be able to listen better to the other side, and to be able to model a willingness to hear what the other side is saying, not necessarily to change our minds, but to be able to say, okay, can we have a respectful dialogue? Can I sit with somebody different? And because even if when we emerge with a respectful dialogue, which is so different than what's going on, we emerge with a bit more of a sense of safety about how to do this. But as soon as we go at trying to change someone's mind, as soon as they sense that my purpose of the dialogue is to change your mind, a difference goes on. And one of our good colleagues around here, a guy named Bill Doherty, who's a wonderful friend of Collaborative and a mental health professional, started this, was one of the founders of what was at the time called Better Angels, from the Lincoln speech, the better angels of our nature. And now they've called Stronger Angels because somebody had that. But the idea of what they do is they bring people, blue and red people, together to have a dialogue. And, and it's just a wonderful organization with that, because again, it's not about changing minds, but if you can get a dialogue, get to the deeper understanding, then it starts to become clear that we connect at the source with the same values. Now, how do we get to the dialogue in a way that hopefully will permeate up to our politicians? We keep saying it's the politicians that aren't doing it, but we're the ones that we're getting the politicians we deserve because we're not doing it. We're not doing it internally. So,
what's the name of that organization?
It's now called Braver Angels. Braver Angels, yeah, and it used to be Better Angels, and it's a wonderful organization that, and they go out, they create community groups, and so you probably one in your community where you could organize, and they would line up 3 or 4 red people, 3 or 4 blue, and you could help facilitate a discussion. And then they do international events, they do stuff online, but let's just talk, folks, and let's respect each other. That's a
That's great.
a great thought.
Yeah.
But it's exactly in line with what we're talking about. You said it's the legal, what goes on in the legal front is a metaphor for what goes on in the broader world.
On some of the talking heads on I'll just call them the opinion shows, not so much even the news shows, are people who are following the model of lawyers in courtrooms. They use the argumentative stuff, the rhetorical questions, the leading questions, all those tactics that you see trial lawyers have used, and they're following the lawyer's lead. So now, as within the lawyer community, the legal community, we're building up different ways of being advocates without argument. We're building up different things outside of the court. Maybe 5-10 years from now, we'll see that trickle down onto the opinion shows. They'll still follow lawyers, but they'll be able to follow lawyers who are having holistic, good-intentioned, non-positional, but advancing learning conversations.
Yeah, no, that's so, because it's an interesting, the idea of the lawyer skill as argument. I don't think it occurs to people that if you're dealing with a person who hasn't made up his or her mind, a judge trying to figure out if the light was red or green, argument is useful. If they don't have any idea what it should be, argument is a good way to figure that out. But if you're dealing with somebody who's made up his or her mind even a little bit, argument will just push them deeper into where they were at.
Yeah.
And I think if people look at their life experiences, you've almost never dealt with anybody whose mind was made up in which any clever argument made ever changed their mind.
Yeah.
We all have that. So if that doesn't work, then we have to think about what does work. And that's, again, the lawyer model is do it by argument. Although it's interesting because sometimes the best new ideas are the oldest ideas. Some of our great lawyers of the world, Gandhi and Lincoln, a lot of their stuff talks about getting along and being lawyer as counsel. I think the lawyer as gladiator really just emerged in kind of the middle of 20th century. And it became kind of a money thing too, because if you had a lot of money, you could exert a lot of power through lawyer argument. And so it went away from lawyer as argument, lawyer as counsel to lawyer as gladiator. And unfortunately, it's been hard to untangle that, but I think we're trying to get back to the days in which lawyers were counsel to people.
It's a more noble way to practice law, in my opinion. But and not to go against the argument, like how you said, sometimes argument serves a purpose. And in the courtroom, the judge hopefully has an open mind and is seeing arguments from both sides and weighing all the evidence at both sides to help form an opinion or to make findings. And that does serve a purpose at that time. Whereas in our media, we're seeing them using that model, but they're only doing half of it. You'll see one channel show only the arguments from this side, another channel showing only the arguments from the other side, and not putting it all together.
And unfortunately, we're in a situation where we all can just tune into whatever station is going to tell us what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And so the idea of an objective, kind of even-handed view presented to people who really haven't made up their mind is really rare. You almost never see that kind of, can you give me an even-handed discussion about what the pros and cons are of this particular issue? Because I haven't made up my mind. That almost never happens, so. And so, yeah, but I see signs of that culture returning, and you hope that next generation is tired of what the boomers have created and maybe want to create something on their own. So
creating collaborative law process, and with Kim with integrative law movement, I do see a lot going in a nice direction, And so going back to how I started this, you see life's possibilities, and we started talking about, you think you're so proud of being a part of what the collaborative law movement has been in the last 30 years, but you're excited about the possibilities for the future and what you even see there. So do you have any ideas, or what do you think some of those possibilities could be?
Yeah, no, I do. And I do think, and I start with the lawyer part, the idea of lawyer as counsel, the idea one of my good friends, Sue Cochran, was saying about, courtrooms with a heart, where if you go into a courtroom, you have a warm, engaging person who sits down. I mean, you're seeing this now with drug courts and some other ones where rather than a judge up there saying this is the way it's going to be, they become community centers of how can we help you for this situation. That the law can be used as a entry point for people to find solutions other than having a who's right and who's wrong part of the solution. And I think you're seeing bits and pieces of that even in the courtroom start to happen. And we did I was actually Kim was part of this in terms of sending some people to it. We did a seminar here in an international forum with people from 7 continents about 8 years ago called Divorce, What's Love Got to Do with It? And it was the idea of matching love and divorce. Now, where in the world would you ever think you could have a dialogue like that? But there was funded by a place called the Fetzer Institute, which is an old organization that have millions and millions of dollars that they spend just on trying to find examples of love in the world in all sorts of businesses and law. And so I think that's going to be more common, that we're going to get to that. I think we've got to find a way to make that happen in the political arena so that it starts to filter down. But I think lawyers are certainly people that can make a big difference in each legal segment, and then hopefully it'll circulate up to the political world. But I think there's some areas of law that we do now, like parenting issues, that I clearly think at certain times you're not even going to think there were legal decisions. There isn't any rational reason that if you have an honest difference about whether your child should be in one home versus the other, that's a parenting decision. If you really cared about it, you say, okay, find me the best parenting expert in the world, and we'll sit in a room with him or her, and we'll have him or her explain, and we'll listen to their advice. You wouldn't if you were coming from a desert island somewhere trying to invent a system of law, you wouldn't say, boy, when we have parenting discussions, we're going to get a person with a law degree and a robe who knows anything about children to tell us. And that's just crazy. You'd never do that unless that was sort of imposed on you. So there are some areas that simply don't belong in the law, other areas that are ripe for legal stuff. But even in those areas, I think the law and the courtrooms are changing. Even the architecture is changing. At that conference, we had architects there saying, build courtrooms differently, have them look differently. Even in the criminal area, to try to, obviously getting people, that's a whole different idea, but rather than sending people and being cages, can we put people in a situation where they can improve their lives? And law and the courtroom as being the springboard for that. Those are all things that I think are out there, but they have a long ways to go.
What does integrative law or being an integrative lawyer mean to you?
Being more human, the idea that lawyers can be human beings. Sometimes I think that's the best part of collaborative law. Sometimes I say it. So we're just trying to become more human. And for me, being more human does mean listening, recognizing the connectedness, recognizing the greater self. The idea that the truly great things in the world can't necessarily be measured. Einstein had that statement that, not all things that can be measured count, and not all things that count can be measured. Most of the really valuable things cannot be measured. They're part of our relationships, our well-being. And I think lawyers have this notion. We get rewarded based on the stuff we can measure. I got more spousal maintenance or alimony from my client than somebody else did. That's all measurable. But if I damage their relationship, nobody can measure that. So nobody's going to care about it. And so integrative law, I think, means, going back to that core, sensing that connected, sensing it, healing. And we haven't talked about this, but I know on the website, the idea of working with the inner self, what's going on inside of me, and whether it's for me or for my client. I'm a big believer in the Serenity Prayer, whether you see it as a prayer or even as a secular way of belief, but the idea of separating out what you can control from what you cannot control is so important in what we do. Well, the things we have the most control over are things inside of us. We have less control over what the other person, the other spouse does. And I think integrative law invites us, whether through meditation or mindfulness or any kind of just healthcare, to say, okay, how can we start within us? How can we, if we're talking about peace, how can we have the peace begin within us rather than talking about what other people ought to do? So to me, integrative law builds on those ideas and takes law out of that whole right and wrong, I've got more power than you universe, back to the problem-solving universe. And I remember Dean Link, a professor from Notre Dame, speaking to our group once and saying there was a time when law was one of the healing professions. There was medicine to heal the body, clergy to heal the soul. and lawyers were there to heal the conflict. And we've forgotten that. I mean, that was an old idea that we were supposed to be healers. We were supposed to be ones to break up the fight, and now we're perceived as the people to pick the fight. And that got tangled, and I think we're going to hopefully evolve on the other side much more enlightened than we have once we can get past this.
And thank you for picking up on the inner self part of integrative law, because so much part of it is you have to be in integrity with yourself, or you not have to, you get to be in integrity with yourself in your practice, in your personal life. They're all in, you're one person. You could be your whole person in all the areas that you do. To do that, you have to have inner healing, inner self-love, inner knowing of who you are so that you can have that integrity. And that's not just for lawyers, that's for anyone in all that we do.
Well, that's one of the things when I talk to my kids, I've got growing kids about, a profession, choose a profession in which improving your professional skills involve improving your human being skills. The things that would make me a better lawyer are things that make me a better person. The more I can work on being a better person, the better lawyer I'll be. And it's nice to have that in harmony. There are some professions for which that's not true, but it is true among good lawyering, I think. So.
That's wonderful. Well, we're going to leave it at that because I love that.
Well, thank you. This has been so delightful. I've been honored to be a part of this. And I'm not lying that it has inspired me to get more consciously involved with integrative law, because I've always been a believer, but I've been so busy with my collaborative law thing, I haven't spent as much time connecting what we do together, which is a big part of what I want to do more.
Well, thank you so much for being part of Integrative Lawyers of the World.
Thank you.